Canadian clients say to us, please form us a U.S. entity through which we will conduct our business, we would rather have that entity engage in transactions in the United States so that if we have problems with any of our U.S. customers or tax authorities, we will deal and resolve those issues through the U.S. company rather, and not our Canadian entity. Excuse me. So let me turn to the single most common form of entity that we form in the States for our Canadian friends, and that would be a U.S. corporation. The process of forming a corporation is not unlike that with which you are probably familiar in Canada. It involves the filing of what is generally called a certificate of incorporation. In effect, the certificate of incorporation becomes the entity's birth certificate. And once that is filed with the appropriate state Secretary of State, then your entity exists. Unlike Canada, where you do have federal corporations, we have no such thing in the United States. So the formation of a corporation is done at the state level. Now, by definition, therefore, we have 50 states from which to choose. I always find it somewhat humorous. The state of Delaware must do a fine advertising job in Canada, because very frequently when Canadians come to me to talk about the formation of a corporation in the United States, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, well, let's form a Delaware corporation. To which my first response always is, why? And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the fact of the matter is that in most cases, the jurisdiction in which you are going to probably form your corporation in the States is where you are going to set up your base of operations. Here in New York, since we have a number of Canadian clients who have set up their operations in Buffalo or other New York State-based cities, it is quite common for our Canadian friends who have us form U.S. corporations to form them in New York. If you are going to set up your base of operations in one of the other states, most of the time it will make sense for you to form a corporation in that state. It is true that there are some states that do not have corporate level taxes, and that may or may not present a viable choice for you to select a state in which there are no state taxes. But let me just use as an example Nevada, for example, or Delaware, which do not have corporate level taxes at the state level. If you were to form a Delaware corporation, but your base of operations was in New York State anyway, you are going to have to register the corporation in New York, and you're going to end up paying New York corporate taxes on the income derived from New York in any event. So the selection of the jurisdiction in which you form the company is a little bit more complicated than simply saying, let's go to Delaware. I also want to comment on another issue that comes up all the time, and this has to do with names. And this is a very important point. The selection of your name, obviously you're going to choose a name for your corporation that in most cases you think has a viable marketing benefit. But having said that, please be careful. The mere fact that you can form a corporation in any one of the 50 states under a given name does not mean that you can use that name in commerce. So let me repeat that, because this is very important. The mere fact that you can form a corporation under a given name does not mean that you can use it in commerce. Let me give you an example. I might be able to go to the state of Montana or Utah or Pennsylvania and file a certificate of incorporation for a company called Xerox Flower Shop, or possibly Kellogg's Auto Sales. But if I tried to use the name Xerox Flower Shop on my flower shop, or I tried to open up a car dealership called Kellogg's Auto Sales, I dare say that it wouldn't take very long before I got a very pointed letter from the lawyers representing Xerox or Kellogg's demanding that I stop doing business under those names, and they would win. So, when you decide to come here and form a corporation, it is important that you first analyze what names you want to actually trade under, and then conduct a search to make sure that your use of those names in the states will not violate somebody else's pre-existing trademark or other intellectual property rights. How do you do that? Some people choose to just Google it, and they'll Google their proposed name and see what comes up. You can check the 50 states yellow pages and see what comes up. On a more formal basis, you can do a search of the United States Patent and Trademark Office records, and that will give you an official search. But this is something that you need to be aware of. While we're talking about corporations, let me comment on another issue that Canadian clients often talk about, which is this notion of an S corporation. In the United States, for United States citizens, it is true that you can form a corporation here, and by filing an election under what is called Subchapter S of the Internal Revenue Code, you can avoid paying taxes at the corporate level, and the profits and losses of that corporation are passed through to the shareholders, and they simply report it on their personal tax return. But that privilege is essentially limited to U.S. citizens. Therefore, a Canadian who wants to come over and form a U.S. corporation, or a Canadian entity that wants to be a shareholder of U.S. corporation, cannot get S corporation treatment. Therefore, when you form your corporation here, you will have to file U.S. taxes and pay taxes on taxable income of that entity. That being the case, I want to now transition to my last main topic, which is to at least familiarize you for a couple of minutes with an entity that is sometimes used in the States called a limited liability company. Now, I believe I am correct in saying that in Canada, the only province where limited liability companies have been authorized to date is Nova Scotia. I could be wrong, but I think that that is correct. Let me briefly describe what a limited liability company is. It is a mutation, if you will. It is a combination of a general partnership on the one hand and a corporation on the other. It is an entity that does not pay taxes at the entity level. In other words, if you form a limited liability company and conduct business through that kind of entity, it will not pay taxes to the Internal Revenue Service on income that it derives. For every $100 of income that a corporation would have, it might pay $35 in income at the 35% tax rate. If you have a limited liability company and it earns $100, it will pay $0 to the federal government in taxes. Instead, that $100 is passed through to its owners, who are called members, and they recognize the tax on their individual tax returns and pay taxes at their individual tax return level, much like a partnership. The beauty of a limited liability company is that not only does it give the members the benefit of the pass-through of tax profits and losses, but as a matter of state statute, it gives them protection of limited liability, otherwise previously offered only to corporations. So think of it this way. A limited liability company is more or less a general partnership that has the benefit of limited liability, or alternatively, it is a corporation that has the benefit of pass-through treatment for tax purposes. And so under the right circumstances, limited liability companies may be the form of entity that you choose to use here. As an aside, I will say that most of our Canadian friends who have us form entities in the States, they still tend to form corporations instead of limited liability companies. Number one, because they're not really familiar with LLCs. And number two, for U.S.-Canada tax purposes, a lot of times our Canadian clients would actually prefer to have their accumulated income stay in their U.S.-based corporation rather than have to move it back to Canada and use that money with which to pay the taxes on the income that they have earned. So the issues that will affect your decision of what type of entity to form, I believe, are basically this. The number of owners that you have is going to be a factor. The importance of limited liability is going to be a very significant factor and probably drive you in the direction of either forming a corporation or a limited liability company and staying away from an entity like a general partnership. The cost is not a big factor in any event. The approximate cost of forming a corporation or a limited liability in the United States, I would budget about $1,000 for each. And in each case, you have an annual cost of maintaining them here. Now, the annual cost of a corporation here is going to include your annual cost of filing a tax return, and you will have to have what's called a statutory agent in the United States. If, for example, you form a New York corporation, but you don't have any people here, you don't have an office here, it's a marketing entity, state law will require that you have a service bureau serve as a legal agent of the corporation in New York State. Those tend to run about $300 or $350 per year. So your carrying cost of a corporation here is going to be approximately, let's say, that $300 or $350 per year for the service bureau and whatever it costs you to prepare your tax returns. A limited liability company would also require a statutory agent, but it's not going to have to pay any taxes in the state, so that would be a little bit cheaper to maintain on an annual basis. Tax issues, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be somewhat of a factor, and whether you choose a corporation or a limited liability company, I would discuss that with your chartered accountant, and it may vary from circumstance to circumstance. The pass-through treatment versus the separate tax-paying entity, we've already talked about that. And finally, in how many states will your entity be doing business? The phrase doing business is really a term of art, and what I mean by that is to the extent that you actively have business operations in a particular state, you're going to have to register the entity in that state. So, for example, if you formed a corporation in New York, but you had a satellite office in Pittsburgh, you would have to register the corporation in Pittsburgh. You do not have to form another corporation in Pennsylvania. The New York corporation can do business in the state of Pennsylvania, but you have to register in Pennsylvania because you have an office there. So depending upon how many states in which you might be doing business and where you have to register may affect the decision of what kind of entity you will be forming. So having said that, I appreciate your patience. I know that we are running against the